50 years, circumstances had changed, but the aspirations and the expectations of ordinary working people, working class, middle class, self-employed, those who came from every area of society, their expectations had changed. In the United Kingdom, and I'll tell you, they've changed in Portugal and in the rest of Europe as well. What was good enough for our grandfathers will never be good enough for our children. When my mother was given a council house, it was a great boon for her because she had been living in a room with her relations when she got married. And the fact that she was told she had to have the same coloured door as everyone else didn't stop her enjoying it. Don't tell my children they're going to have the same door or the same house or the same anything or the same car as anyone else. They expect a personal level of service which is far beyond anything that was given before. So, people are better off, they've got higher expectations, and the service they received in the private sector had also changed. Their consumer experience across every range of product was such that they expected it in the public service as well. In short, increasingly in the world outside the public services, people were getting a level of service that was far higher than anything they got inside the public services. Now, there were two huge implications of these developments. One, the power of choice for ordinary people had to be incorporated into the public service, including into the health service. Not just because it was something they deserved, but because if we didn't do that, as people became increasingly affluent, they would walk away from the public service. There would increasingly be no public service, or if it was left as a public service, it would only be as a very low-level safety net for those who had no money in their pocket whatsoever to provide something better. And secondly, that meant that this was not only a question of giving people what they deserved, but the self-preservation of the National Health Service itself. To put it simply, the National Health Service had to be reformed because the expectations of modern people demanded it and its very survival required it. That will happen in Portugal as well, unless there is an incorporation of patient power inside the health service, because as people see what others are getting outside, they will demand it of their own health service. And the central element of that reform programme is patient empowerment. Now, it sounds easy to say, and in the rhetoric of politicians, it is always easy to deliver, because all you need to do is stand here and demand it and then leave the rostrum. It's up for others to do it. But actually, there are massive obstacles to delivering that, because this isn't just a matter of decision-making, it's a matter of vested interest. Let's look at some, very briefly, of the obstacles that you have to overcome. First of all, it employed 1.3 million employees. It was a massive bureaucratic organisation. Secondly, hospitals had a bureaucratic culture, as did most of the National Health Service itself. Thirdly, it was a centralised institution where it was completely alien to its culture to have people who were consumers making the decisions and everyone responding to it. The way this worked is I made the decisions in Whitehall and I instructed the providers, and you got what I thought was good for you. You didn't get what you thought was good for you. You got what I thought was good for you. But in every other experience of life, when you went shopping, you weren't told by the person who was selling you the product what you wanted. You told them what you wanted. So I wanted a health service where you could have the operation you wanted, at the time you wanted, in the hospital you wanted, where you wanted, even if you didn't happen to be paying for that at the time, but paying for it through taxation. In effect, the power, including the power of choice, lay with the producers and the providers, the politicians, the consultants, the staff, and the unions dictated which hospital would provide your service, when you would receive it, and how it would be provided. If we were going to modernise the NHS effectively, we had to change that completely. Let me quickly list for you the main elements of the systemic and cultural change that were necessary in order to achieve the results I showed you earlier. And I think whatever the system you have are probably going to be necessary in any big change. In headline terms, you will need political drive from the centre. That political drive will have to build structures and systems that pass the power away from the centre. You begin with 80% central drive, but unless you end up with 80% demand from the bottom driving the system, it will not be sustainable. But you need political will, you need improved capacity, you need greater diversity of production, you need an element of competition, you need information on choices for the consumer themselves to exercise it, because otherwise it's only a theoretical choice they have. You need technological assistance to all of those elements, and above all, you need patient financial power. In other words, even if the patient isn't paying for it, the money to pay for it must follow the patient's choice. Because otherwise, I will be paying Hospital A the same amount of money as Hospital B, even if I think Hospital A isn't worthy of treating me and I choose to go to Hospital B. So you must have a system where even if I am not paying, if the central government's paying, the money is following the patient's choice. Let me take them briefly. Political will, it's not easy, because you will be attacked if you attempt to reform from the left and the right. Not for the first time, the leftist argument will be a peculiar mirror image of the rightist argument. The left will argue that the National Health Service should not be reformed, since that would be a betrayal of its founding principles. Even if it was free, you don't want those nasty capitalists involved in it. So they would argue it should not be reformed. And the right wing will argue that it could not be reformed because it was such a centralised bureaucratic organisation you could never introduce competition in it. Those arguments can be taken head on, and they can be won. I won't go through them, maybe on another occasion, but I can assure you they can be won. Secondly, in increasing the capacity, the quantity of services in relation to the demand for services to allow the degree of choice. One of the reasons that you want to liberate the private sector at the disposal of people who are not paying directly out of their own pocket is because by doing so, you reverse the relationship between the consumer and the producer, and you put the consumer in a position where there is more supply for the services than there is demand, and therefore the consumer begins to exert the power which isn't there if there is more demand for the service than there is supply. And that is when you have a monopoly operated with scarce resources only from the public sector. Thirdly, by the introduction of new innovative types of providers in both the public and private sectors. Diversity. So we brought in treatment centres, which were hospitals that specialised in one operation. They may do kidney stones, they may do cataracts, but they did them in far greater numbers, so you get an efficient use, 24 hours a day of resources. Mobile treatment centres, so that they would go to the area of greatest demands, because you would have regional and local differences in it. Local doctors, general practitioners were encouraged and incentivised to extend their practice, and obviously the use of private facilities in diagnostics and hospitals. All of that gives you a diversity of supply to match an increased volume of supply. Fourthly, we had to make a market. You will not increase the productivity and efficiency to the benefit of the patients in the public sector unless you make a market, unless there is competition. It doesn't take 50% in the private sector to galvanise the public sector into action. Those figures that you saw, the vast reductions in waiting time and waiting numbers, were brought about by just about 10% of the operations being allocated to the private sector. That was